Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy. Today I'll be creating a slimline card using the new Make-A-Wish die set. There is a coordinating stamp set for this die set, but I kind of wanted to try and make the balloons look like the Mylar balloons, so I decided just to use the die set. I die cut the number 5 from Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, and with R81 I drew a line down the center of my little balloon just to make sure that I maintained that as a really nice bright highlight. Of course, after I did the R81 I thought that might be a little bit dark, so I went over that with RV00 just to fade out the R81 a little bit. I did cut a little piece of one of my nonstick craft mats and used temporary adhesive to hold my balloon in place while I colored it, just so it wouldn't be moving all over the place while I was trying to color it. Once I was done with the RV00, I came in with R85 and went around the very outer edges. And I used the R85 pretty sparingly because I wanted to make sure that I left the outer edges of the balloon very dark. Then I added tiny little triangles at the very bottom of the balloon where it's gathered together so that it would have the deeper edges for the pleats. Then I came in with R83 and I blended out the R85 just a little bit, and I moved closer to the center, still maintaining that center highlight. I wasn't too worried about getting a perfect blend with my markers on this first pass. I just wanted to get the shadows in and the highlight in where I wanted them to be. And it's with the R83 where I really start coming in and rounding out the balloon a little bit more. And once I finished with the first layer of R83, I came back in with the R81 and blended it up. Came in with the RV00 and blended all of it out together. Then I did come back in with the R85 just to darken up some of the areas, and I thought I could probably use another coat of the R83. So I just went over that one more time with the R83 and brought it in a little bit closer to the center to lighten up that center highlight just a tiny little bit. Once I was done with all of that coloring, I did come back in with the RV00 and I went down just the very center to brighten up that center highlight a little bit more. For the zero balloon, I did the exact same technique. I started out with the R81, went over that with the RV00 to maintain that center highlight. Then I went around the outer edges with the R85 and again added the little pleats at the bottom. And then I came in with the R83, still maintaining that highlight, and it was at this point that I realized that I needed to do R85 around the center of the zero because that would be further back than the very center of the balloon where the highlight is. I hope that makes sense. And blended that out a little bit with the R83. Then I came back in with the RV00 to blend all of that in together. Then I came back in with the R83 to add a little more dark around the edges, and then realized that I lost my shadows on the very bottom of the balloon. So I came in with the R85 and added a little bit more of the R85 as well. Once I was done coloring in the balloons, I did die cut them 2 more times from white cardstock and stacked them up with some glue. Once I had them stacked up, I did use the R85 and went around the edges of the balloons just so that they wouldn't have that white edge. Then to make them nice and glossy and shiny, I came in with Nouveau Crystal Glaze and applied that over the top of the whole balloon. I like the Nouveau Crystal Glaze a little bit better than Glossy Accents. It's thinner, so it comes out of the bottle a little bit easier, and you barely have to squeeze the bottle to have it come out. I also think that it might dry a little bit faster because it is thinner. So once I had those coated up with my Nouveau Crystal Glaze, I very, very carefully moved them off of my craft table and set them aside so that the glaze could dry completely. And then I started working on my cake. Again, it's also die cut from Cougar Super Smooth cardstock. And I did a quick coat over the entire cake with R81. Then I came in with R85 and colored in from the outer edges towards the center. And I was being pretty conservative with the R85 at first because I wasn't quite sure how far I needed to bring it in, because I wasn't sure how much of the icing was going to cover those outer edges. After I was done with the R85, I came in with R83 and brought the R83 closer into the center. And then I blended all of that out with the R81. And I did use the chisel tip of my marker when I was blending that out, just to get rid of some of those harsher marker lines that I had, and to make sure that I had the R85 brought in far enough, because I did want to have the darkest color on the very outer edges of my cake. I did bring in the frosting every now and again just to see if I had enough of a shadow on the outer edges. And then I would continue to blend with the R83 and then again with the R81. Once I was done coloring the cake and had all of the blending where I wanted it to be and the shading to be where I wanted it to be, I decided to add some texture to my cake. So I just took R85, R83, and R81 and just did tiny little dots all over the whole cake. For the icing, I kept it very, very simple. I started out with N2 and concentrated this on the very outer edges of the frosting. I wanted the frosting to be a bright white, but I did want to add in some shading. So with the N2, I concentrated that on the very outer edges, and then I blended that out with N0. With the N0, when I got down to the wider drip that's on the bottom of the frosting, I did blend that up a little bit further. And I did the same thing on the other two layers of frosting as well. I started with the N2 on the outer edges and then blended it towards the center with the N0. Now I did want to stack up the frosting, but because the frosting layers on top of each other, I did cut the drips off of the bottom layer of the frosting before I stacked the frosting that I had colored with the markers on top of it, just so that it would lay flat when I went to put my whole cake together. I did very simple coloring for the cake plate, but I did stack that onto another piece as well, just for a little bit more dimension. Now, when putting the cake together, the one thing that I learned is that you do want to start from the bottom and build up, because the icing drips lay on top of each other. So I used liquid glue to adhere the plate to my cake, and then liquid glue for all of the icing. The reason that I chose to use liquid glue is so that I would have some wiggle room to make sure that I got it lined up just right. Once I had my cake put together, I set that aside and started to work on my card front. I'm using the new Dainty Daisy's Slimline background stamp, which is a red rubber stamp. It stamps beautifully and it's ginormous. I inked it up with some yellow ink, and then I placed a piece of yellow cardstock on top of that because I wanted to have more of a tone-on-tone look. I didn't want the background to overtake the focal point on the front of the card. I ran the yellow cardstock through my die cut machine with the Slimline Card Builder die, and then I adhered that to the front of my note card, which started out at 8.5 by 7. I scored it at 3.5 inches on the 7-inch side, so my finished card is 3.5 by 8.5. I did attach some pink and white baker's twine to my balloons. I die cut the word happy 3 times from white cardstock and stacked it up as well. And then I put a little bit of foam tape on parts of the back of the word happy because I wanted it to lay more flat, and with the balloon strings behind the die cut word happy, it would get a little bit wonky, so I just added it on the areas kind of around where the balloon strings were going to lay down. I did use liquid glue to adhere my balloons to the front of the card, and then wiggled and jiggled the balloon strings until I had that where I wanted them to be, which was behind the word happy. Once I finally got happy where I wanted it to be, I pressed that into place. I stamped the word happy from the Happy Sayings stamp set and used one of the Simple Sentiment strips dies to cut that out. I put some foam tape on the back of that and adhered that under the word happy. And of course I had to add a whole bunch of foam tape to the back of my cake and put that into place. Once I had my cake in place, I kept looking at it thinking that I wanted to add something more to the frosting, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So then I finally made up my mind and decided that I was going to add a little bit of sparkle. So I used my Wink of Stella glitter pen on the icing. And then I used a little bit of temporary tape to hold my card closed because I wanted to make my frosting sparkly and shiny. So I did apply the Nouveau Crystal Glaze over the icing as well. And a tip when doing the icing on the cake, I would recommend that you start from the bottom and go up. That way you won't dip your hand into the crystal glaze. After I had the icing all coated with the crystal glaze, I found some pink beads in my stash, and I very carefully sprinkled a couple of the pink beads over the crystal glaze while it was still wet. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.